Okay, welcome back everybody to the University of Idaho and University of Wyoming Extension Sheep Program's Sheep and Goat webinar series. And I'm Melinda Ellison, UI Extension Sheep Specialist, and your other host that is not speaking today is Carmen Wilmore, who's your Extension Educator in Lincoln County for Idaho. And today your speaker is Whit Stewart, who is the University of Wyoming's Sheep Specialist. Before we get rolling, make sure that you follow us on Facebook at UI Sheep and Goats or at UW Sheep. We post all of our webinars to our YouTube channel, University of Idaho Extension Livestock. So subscribe there, and then you can also follow our webpage. So today, Whit is going to be speaking about ram management considerations in the Intermountain West, and I will go ahead and pass it off to you.
Good. Thank you everyone for being here today. I'm grateful for this opportunity to collaborate with U of I and, kind of expand the scope of our programming. Today, we're going to talk about ram management considerations in our region in the Intermountain West. Again, I think there's a lot of overlap to other regions of the country, but we are a diverse industry within the lower 48. And as a result, there's some nuance there that I think we see. And so even though this is tailored primarily to producers in the Intermountain West, I think there's a pretty broad application. Just a little bit about me. I think many of you I know already, but this is kind of a background of where I've been and things I've worked on. I started my education in Idaho, actually, at BYU, Idaho. After that, I went to Oregon State and had some really great experiences up there with a lot of people at Oregon State University looking at selenium supplementation research in sheep. After that, a brief stint with the University of Wyoming Extension, which kind of really fueled the passion to want to go on and pursue a specialist career. With that, I traveled to Texas A&M AgriLife in San Angelo and worked as a research associate while concurrently doing the PhD research at that station in San Angelo. Went on campus to New Mexico State, where I finished the coursework, helped coach the wool judging team there, and was involved in some other research projects. And my first position out of my PhD was at Montana State University, which were two really excellent years for me. In that capacity, I was 80% extension with some research and service. I filled in 1 year teaching sheep production and also oversaw the wool lab, which brings me to now where I'm at currently at the University of Wyoming. My responsibilities have changed a little bit. I do a little bit of everything here. I love all components of my appointment, but the majority of that is outreach to producers with a heavier research appointment than previous years, training graduate students, which is something that's really fulfilling for me. And then I teach two classes, our sheep production class and then an intro to wool evaluation. So do a little bit of everything, not great at any one of those most of the time, but it's an enjoyable experience working in the sheep industry. I would go toe-to-toe with anyone telling them that the sheep industry is the best livestock industry to work with, hands down. So today we're going to talk about a little bit of everything related to ram management, but with particular emphasis on nutrition. In our region, I think ram nutrition pre and post breeding is something that we can improve upon dramatically and probably see some pretty great turnaround in our longevity of our rams. We're going to talk about some visual observations, some of the differences in sheep breeding behavior than perhaps we're familiar with in cattle, and then some animal health considerations. And then at the tail end, I'm going to take a hard right and talk about phenotypic evaluation. And my rationale for that is we had the opportunity to hear from Dr. Tom Murphy from US Mark. Dr. Ellison's going to address us next week on some selection. And I think as we talk about advancing selection and the various ways that we can select for better sheep, I think oftentimes it's neither or and it doesn't need to be. And so I'm going to talk about the phenotypic side that might give us some opportunities. In the Intermountain West, again, not to spend a ton of time on this, but we produce a pretty significant proportion of the U.S. lamb crop. This table just kind of shows the geography of Wyoming, Utah, and Idaho, and then in the USA, the various total sheep inventories in these states, that's ewes and lambs. And then the number of operations and the breakdown by operational size. And I think it's worth mentioning the importance of how different goals and objectives can be across different flock sizes. I sometimes grow tired of the small versus large kind of antagonism that exists in our industry. I think we're all needed, no matter what our operational size is. But with that comes those differences in terms of what production challenges we experience. And you can see in Wyoming, the proportion of our sheep producers that are in the 300 to 10,000 range is almost 20% of our total inventory. As the U.S. as a whole, that's about 1.5% of those operations that are 300 or greater head operations. And so, again, I take a spin. I work a lot with our range sheep people here and some of our smaller farm flock people, but those differences that exist are predominantly a consequence of the environment that we run in. Nutritional, climatic differences all influence the productivity of our rams. I've worked over the course of my short career with a lot of purebred stud producers, whether they be NSIP producers or non-NSIP producers. And what's interesting to me is if we were to do some math based off of the ag census data that we have, we would see that we require a lot of rams on an annual basis. That first column there is the state, followed by the number of breeding ewes in each state, in that second column. And then I calculate the 3 rams to 100 ewe ratio. So I basically divide 33 ewes per that 215 mark for Wyoming, and that gives us about 6,500 rams required annually. Now, that's a lot of rams. If you think about our ram sales in the country and combine the total numbers, especially in the Intermountain West, we'd probably barely exceed 1,500 rams total. So there's a lot of rams that are traded. There's a lot of rams that are utilized. And especially if we think about decreased longevity, if we have to replace certain rams every year, or approximately 20 to 30% of our ram battery, that last column kind of highlights the new rams coming into the ram flock in these various states. I know with pretty good certainty in our region that we struggle with ram longevity issues, and that is pretty breed dependent actually, and we're going to talk about that. But there's a lot of rams that we rely upon each year to produce our lamb crop, and they're often overlooked. We spend a lot of time getting excited for ram sales. We turn them out with the ewes, and then the little less anticlimactic, and we bring them back post-breeding and hang on to them for another calendar year. There's things that we can do to improve. Again, this is a 2017 ag census figure, and it just kind of shows in the Intermountain West, approximately 40% of our lamb crop. I say approximately because that changes from year to year, but for the most part, we are a pretty significant proportion of the lamb being produced in our country. So let's first talk about breeding soundness exams. This could be just an entire talk all in itself, but something to think about is that we look forward to breeding season. Those of us that are breeding for January lambs, that's coming sooner than those of us wanting May and June lambs. But an important component to think about is what are we doing in advance of scheduling that breeding soundness exam? Obviously, we will work with a clinician to help schedule that and do the semen evaluation, but something to keep in mind is what happens to that ram that can affect its spermatogenesis or the maturation of that sperm is 47 days prior to that actual sperm maturing, okay? So there's a lot that can happen prior to the time that we collect that semen and evaluate it. So it's kind of looking back through a time machine a little bit and saying, what happened 47 days prior? And am I seeing something that's a result of management, or is it just a natural defect that ram is experiencing? Another important aspect to think about is retesting is really important. If you think about the money that we spend on these rams, all the work that's gone into identifying those specific traits that we want to improve upon, it would be a sad day if we just gave that ram one shot, one breeding soundness exam, especially on the semen side of things, before we pulled the plug on it. I always recommend, especially for studs that are proven and that may have experienced some intense heat stress or some shipping issues or anything that would have stressed that animal, I encourage producers to retest 47 days later. Another thing that I've seen that I think is important, and we'll talk about this in a couple slides later, but it's important that if we're using just some standard criteria, such as scrotal circumference, that we recognize that certain breeds are more seasonal than others. And we always think about that on the ewe side, but we don't always pay a lot of attention to it on the ram side. Rams are also seasonal. Their peak breeding season increases as daylight decreases, or the number of daylight hours decreases. And there's certain breeds that show a lot more seasonal response in terms of scrotal circumference than others. And I'll show that here in a bit, but testing rams in May to use them in the fall for breeding probably is a bit premature. And some of those rams that may experience significant scrotal growth and definite testosterone production later in the season, they may not be experiencing that early on. And so it's important to keep in mind our timeline as to when we do that. Obviously, the two most important parameters that we look at, in addition to the physical fitness of that ram, is the semen motility and morphology. And, you know, these may seem pretty subjective, these ranges, exceptional, satisfactory, or unsatisfactory. I'll show some studies that have been done in the Intermountain West recently that kind of demystify this a little bit. But there are unsatisfactory rams that breed a lot of ewes. I know that's counterintuitive, but there's been enough instances where I've worked with producers where rams have barely passed or haven't passed and turned out they were able to breed ewes. Now, is that something that we should strive for? Absolutely not. We're looking for exceptional and satisfactory ranges, both in motility and morphology. But the reality is that the concentration of semen that is produced, the concentration of sperm in the semen that is produced is pretty high, and the ability to service and get those ewes to conceive is possible with less than ideal rams. One of the categories that we often refer to a lot, because it's correlated to greater first service capacity and increased total fertility, is a larger scrotal circumference. We should not treat all breeds the same when it comes to this. And the more work we're doing here at University of Wyoming, looking at these nuance between nutritional requirements between breeds and different levels of production between breeds, it's apparent to me that some of this criteria should be based off of objective criteria like this, but also should be tailored to the type of breed that you're raising and your management strategies. Generally speaking, we look at rams 8 to 14 months of age as exceptional if they have a greater than 36 centimeter scrotal circumference. Satisfactory is 28 to 36 centimeters, and anything less than 28 I think is unsatisfactory for a ram lamb. Those mature rams that we would designate as 14 months or older, a lot of those yearling rams that we look at in the fall here in our region, really we should be looking for something that's going to, at the very minimum, exceed 32 centimeters. And if you look at the sifting committees across some of our state ram sales, I think there's relative agreement on that bottom end. We don't categorize satisfactory or exceptional scrotal circumference, but those are some of the ranges there. And you know, the work that has looked at what the effects of selecting for increased scrotal circumference have found is that those ewe lambs from those rams with greater scrotal circumference are attaining puberty at a more rapid rate than those that have a smaller scrotal circumference. And so when we say greater fertility, I think that should be caveat a little bit just with the fact that they're earlier attaining of puberty rather than just being more prolific throughout their lifetime. But still, something that we can measure on the ram and put indirect selection pressure on the females that we produce as replacements in our flock. You know, as I prepared for this talk, I try not to recycle too much of the material I talk about. So this has been a good week for me as I've kind of put together some thoughts and was able to look through the literature some more. One of those gems in the research that I found was a great study out of Colorado State University published in 2008. Many of you who know Cleon Kimberling. He's a legend in our eyes. One of the best sheep vets out there, in my opinion, especially from a clinical and research standpoint. Done some really great things. This was a study that they did compiling breeding soundness exams over 11,000 rams over the course of 10 years in the Intermountain West. Now this first table, I don't want to put you to sleep. I'll just clue you into a couple of things. So again, if you look at top, 11,000 breeding soundness exams in the Western US over a 7-year period. Of those, I think it's really interesting that approximately 71% exceed that satisfactory and excellent threshold. But a third of those rams from this study were either questionable or unsatisfactory. And that can be a gray area, but what that does bring into mind is that about 28 to 30% of all of the rams on each of these operations failed these breeding soundness exams. There's various reasons for those, and you can see the majority of those were based off of the substandard semen parameters. And some of the things that were looked at were morphology, motility, leukocyte concentrations, other things like that cause those rams to fail those breeding soundness exams. But it's important to keep in mind that breeding soundness exams are not just the semen, and we'll talk about that. But another interesting aspect of this study that I think was interesting is they found a significantly increased risk factor in smaller flocks in terms of rams failing their breeding soundness exams. And so those ram batteries less than 20 or up to 20, they saw a 34% failure versus a 29% failure in those medium and large ram managed groups. It was also interesting to find that there were some breed effects. And I think this was interesting for me to find as we're trying to do some research looking at ram longevity in our region. But for the most part, those Suffolk or terminal sire type rams that we traditionally consider as terminal sires had a 4 to 5% increased failure rate than some of those other breeds evaluated. Now, again, I don't want to get in trouble because I'm sure there's purebred producers on this call, not singling those out, but I think the management that we put on some of these rams needs to be tailored sometimes to the breeds that we're dealing with and whether they're terminal sires or siring replacement ewes on our operations. One of those challenges that I think was interesting from this study is that pizzle rot or ulcerative prostatitis is something that we see as a result of feeding increased crude protein. I'll show that in a minute. But more interesting, we saw a greater incidence of those failures. I say we. This study found a greater incidence of breeding soundness exam failures as body condition score decreased. And we'll talk about that a little bit, but in our region, there's very few thin rams sold at the ram sale. If we were to go and look at those same rams post-breeding, we would probably see that their condition has changed dramatically. And one thing to think about is what happens to their libido as they decrease in body condition score. Their demands physiologically during the breeding season really require us to rethink how we're managing those rams post-breeding, and I'll talk about that. I'm getting ahead of myself. But let's go back to pizzle rot for a second. This is caused by a cornybacterium that is common in the sheath of the ram, but generally speaking, those ulcers occur, and that what we observe is pizzle rot. In the image, I hope you can see it a little bit better. That ram, the pizzle to the backside shows some pretty dramatic deterioration of that skin and irritation. Something to think about that we can do prior to the ram coming is prior to the ram coming, I'm talking prior to the vet arriving on our operation, it's probably important that we take a look at the diet of those rams as we get ready for breeding season. All ruminant species can only utilize so much crude protein, and the excess crude protein that we feed is excreted predominantly in the urine as urea, and as a result, that acidifies the urine, and we start to see that ulcer form. Whether that is a significant factor in reducing their drive to breed ewes, the literature is somewhat mixed. But what's really important, and I think comes from this Kimberling study that I talked about prior, is that those with pizzle rot, they can be remediated, but at the time they shouldn't be assumed to be satisfactory. They need to be categorized as questionable or unsatisfactory, and not just categorize them that way and move on, but really look at what is the predominant feed source we're providing those. I think a common practice in many parts of the region that I work in is these rams are dry lotted prior to breeding season, both to contain them, but also to manage their nutrition. And the basal diet is predominantly a greater than 18% crude protein alfalfa. And as a result, that high crude protein continues to result in that urea being excreted, and those rams don't heal up. We've seen on some of the ram tests that we've conducted here that when we've exceeded 16% crude protein, we've had a greater incidence of pizzle rot. But with some triple antibiotic ointment and a couple of days of, or a couple of weeks of keeping them on a lower crude protein diet, that does heal up and those rams do just fine. I talked about this earlier in the rams, but I understand that we oftentimes think of the seasonal nature of sheep reproduction and always attribute that to the ewe, and that is true. These images here come from a pretty important study conducted in the 50s, actually, looking at the percent ewes and estrus based on hours of daylight at different latitudes throughout the world. And, you know, as a rule of thumb, and this is just a good reminder, I think, it's not a condemnation of a certain breed if they're seasonal or aseasonal. We also know, based off of recent research, that certain populations within breed are more seasonal than others. But for the most part, the rule of thumb is the higher the latitude, the greater the dependence on daylight changes and more restricted the breeding period. Now, I know there's exceptions to the rule, but this is a rule of thumb we've seen, and it's been substantiated in the literature. And a number of researchers early on in the 50s all the way to the 80s looked at breeds whose origins were located between 35 degrees north and 35 degrees south have a greater tendency to breed at all times, okay? Some work we did at Montana State University with my PhD student Chad Page was looking predominantly at how certain trace minerals affect reproduction, but something that we found that was interesting in these targhee rams that we studied. We started treatment diets in May and continued those clear into September. And we saw a pretty dramatic change in scrotal circumference, about a 20% increase in scrotal circumference from May to September, and a 50% increase in testosterone in those rams from May to September. And I show this to highlight the fact that if we have some of those rams that may have more dramatic increases in scrotal circumference, if we're doing a breeding soundness exam in May, some of those may not make the grade. And so I encourage us at the very least to wait until the middle to the end of July, especially as we deal with some of our seasonal breeds. But understanding that those rams respond to day length is an important consideration, because we don't want to get rid of rams unnecessarily. All right, let's talk a little bit about reproductive behavior of the ewe. And I don't want this to be an academic exercise and talking about all the different behaviors we see across our domesticated livestock species, but more so I wanted to highlight the fact that sheep are very unique in the fact that they hold the initiative for breeding. It's the ewe behavior that solicits the ram's attention, okay? Oftentimes, especially with cattle, we see the bull chasing the ewe or the cow and estrus. I'm clearly a sheep guy. I can't even get my cattle sexes correct here. But it's different in sheep. And the point is that those ewes have specific behavior that attracts the ram and causes multiple courtship activities that result in that ewe getting bred. And a couple of those specific behaviors, next time you're turning out rams and you have a cold beverage and just want to revisit your reproductive curriculum from your undergraduate degree, here's some of the behaviors to keep in mind and then the relative frequency in which you see these. Pretty much with total, almost all ewes will exhibit tail fanning when they're receptive, okay, when they're in estrus. They do that in front of the ram. Obviously, standing firmly when the ram attempts to mount is a cue to us that ewe is ready to be bred. But there's some other more nuanced behaviors that are interesting to keep an eye on, is head turning, or when that ewe turns her head back towards the ram as he approaches to mount. Those are things that encourage the ram and allow that ram to identify those ewes and reciprocate some of that behavior. Obviously, we've seen rams follow the ewes before, a less common, but in approximately half of ewes in estrus. will have this crouching posture, which includes urination after nudging by the ram. Something to think about, and there's been a lot of work done over the years, and I'm not doing all of that research justice, but what we do see is this formation, this harem formation around a dominant ram, especially in multiple ram breeding groups. Those rams that are dominant and more virile and cover more ewes attract the attention as such. Ram behavior, again, similar. We've all seen these things. We've seen rams exhibit the sniffing behavior, the phlegming response, but there's some other ones that perhaps it's worthwhile for us to keep an eye on. And the reason I say it's worthwhile for us to keep an eye on is the literature pretty much agrees that rams exhibiting this behavior is highly correlated with those rams being reproductively fit and covering more ewes. Now, I understand that there's nuance to that. Sometimes those rams are a little bit more private in their interactions, and we don't have a great chance to observe them. But some of these nudging and pawing, these licking, the phlegming response shows some differences in libido, and those rams with the higher libido are those that are going to cover those ewes. I thought it was interesting as I was looking through some of the studies that have been done, and you'd be amazed how many have been done looking at sheep breeding behavior over the years. I think it's interesting that there is, much as I alluded to previously, breed differences. Those merinos show a greater frequency of nudging during the courtship or the estrus period. Suffolk rams usually do have a greater degree of kicking or stomping. I'm sure many of us, with some of our our emerging breeds that are popular, there's similar breeding behavior that may be nuanced there as well. But the point is it's important to keep an eye on this behavior. It gives us an idea of how active those are going to be. One really important thing to keep in mind is that for the majority of matings, most of those occur during daylight hours. This is some work done out of Australia. I haven't found a tremendous amount done in the US, but with some exception, most breeding is completed during the daylight hours. But more importantly, let's think about how hard those rams have to work during the breeding season, oftentimes at the detriment of their own body condition and their own maintenance. One rule of thumb is that rams will travel 2 to 5 times more per day than ewes. So from a caloric expenditure perspective, those rams are burning significantly more calories and expending much more energy trying to cover those ewes than ewes in the same pasture. A study done in Australia showed that rams traveled 2 to 8 miles in a 50-acre breeding pasture. With that, and the energy expended, 8 to 3 services per 13 hours in a single sire joining group. So those rams oftentimes are covering that ewe multiple times, and as a result, again, a significant energy expenditure. You know, I've often talked with producers, and the question is, you know, I have this ram out there and I just don't see him doing a whole lot. And I never tell them to cull based off of what they're visually able to observe. Obviously, that has to be coupled with a breeding soundness exam and some semen evaluation. But the reality is there's good research to show us that approximately 25 to 30% of all rams in any population are of low sex drive and have very little interest in ewes. 25 to 30%. I know none of us want to think about that as we're looking towards to ram sales. We don't want to be buying duds, but that is just a consequence of differences in breeding behavior, and that does exist. And so I think it's important, especially those of us as stud breeders looking for our next generation of studs, if we're not using artificial reproduction methods, is to try and evaluate their serving capacity and libido tests. I realize that for many of us, don't have time to count how many times that ram mounts the ewe, but there's some examples here. I think under serving capacity tests on this slide, I think 3 and 4 are more suited towards commercial applications. None of us are going to spend that amount of time evaluating whether a ram is good or not. But when we turn out that ram, it is worthwhile evaluating every once in a while how active that ram appears. Some work done here at the University of Wyoming in that bottom right-hand figure by Brenda Alexander looked at high-performing rams and low-performing rams. Those rams that that have a propensity to breed more ewes and exhibit that kind of courtship behavior that the ewes respond to. They looked at the number of sniffs specifically, again, thinking back to that previous slide and the different breeding behaviors of the ram, and they found significant more sniffs in those rams that were considered high performing. Again, going back to some of the visual cues that you can keep an eye on to make sure that you aren't wasting resources on rams that don't breed. What about utilizing young rams? You know, a couple of things to keep in mind. I've seen great success and some failure to some degree when we use ram lambs as breeding for first-time breeding. As a rule of thumb, and the literature substantiates this, is that young rams are more inept than mature rams. And that table below kind of shows that mount to service ratios for young rams is that those young rams unnecessarily perhaps are more ineffective in their attempts to breed the ewe. Mature rams have much greater experience in that regard. Something that I thought was interesting is that in mixed breeding groups, I know many of us, especially in the Intermountain West, have a band of ewes and we kick out 15 to 20 rams out in there and hope for the best. And oftentimes these are mixed age groups. Something that has been observed across numerous breeds is that young rams are dominated by older rams and intimidated to service ewes in the presence of older rams. And if you were to do a progeny or a parentage test within a group of sheep, you would see that there are a few very dominant rams that breed the majority of ewes, and then there's a lesser proportion of ewes bred by those younger and less dominant rams. I understand that logistically it's really hard to separate ram-lamb breeding groups from mature breeding groups, but if we are experiencing less success in breeding ram lambs, it may be worthwhile to not only reduce the ratio of ewes that those ram lambs breed, but also keep them, if they're going to be breeding with multiple sires, with similar aged rams. Breeding ewe lambs, and is another aspect that I think we don't always think about. I'm not here to debate today the importance of breeding ewe lambs versus waiting as yearlings. In our region in the Intermountain West, unless we have feed resources to achieve those body weights necessary for ewe lambs to breed up, it doesn't always work well in our region. It has for certain producers. But what is most important to understand is we breed, whether they're ewe lambs or yearlings, they are shy breeders. They do not show the same experienced behavior as mature ewes. Those younger ewes are not going to outcompete the older ewes who are experienced in attracting that attention and exhibiting that behavior that the ram responds to. They also have been shown to once they've been covered once by the ram, and we know that rams, to be effective, cover ewes several times during estrus. The disassociation with that ram, or separation, oftentimes in a group, is harder for that ram to find again. And so I think some of the challenges we may have with breeding ewe lambs is associated with perhaps how we're breeding those ewe lambs. Do we breed them separately? Do we find smaller paddocks? If we're expecting those rams to breed those less experienced younger ewes, those maiden ewes, it's really important that we give them opportunities for success. So I categorize those a little bit based off of some of what I've seen, and what the literature says is using rams that are proven, that have a pretty strong libido, okay? Using those maiden and adult ewe groups, mating those separately is probably a good strategy for us. Selecting paddock size, which will really help those rams stay in close contact with the ewes, is something that can be really helpful. That image to the left shows that some work out of Australia. Again, those first time mating ewes in a small paddock had greater coverage than those in a larger paddock, and in a similar pattern even with the mature ewes. You know, ewe to ram breeding ratios is again highly dependent on our management system. In the Intermountain West, especially large breeding groups that are grazing pastures similar to that image on the bottom, it's recommended of 3 to 4 rams per 100 ewes at a minimum. Sometimes producers even go up to 5. We know that mature rams can cover a lot of ewes, upwards of 150 if we were to do parentage testing. But the challenge that we have to balance and what we have to evaluate is how strung out do we want that lambing season to be? What is the pasture size and the nutritional quality of that pasture where those rams are expecting to work? And what does the terrain look like? There is a lot of dormant pastures that are utilized for breeding in the Intermountain West that I think require a tremendous amount of energy for those rams to find those ewes. If you look at the image up top, and it looks a little bit darkened, but that's an image of a farm flock managed here in Wyoming. Again, smaller paddock size, a lot of available forage, and that ram has pretty close proximity to the ewes so that they can both seek him out when in estrus, and also he can find those after initial matings. So obviously we can see which one is the easier environment to breed in. What can we do to help that ram be more successful during the breeding season from a nutritional standpoint? There's some really good work done in the 80s that showed that testicular size increased when rams were on a higher plane of nutrition, specifically when they increased nutrition 28 days prior to turnout of that ram, okay? They saw an increase in testosterone, LH, and FSH, okay? They saw that the ram had greater stamina throughout the breeding season and was more effective in what he was trying to do. And so this isn't something that we can always do. I understand that many of us flush in our region. I think flushing 1,000 ewes can be expensive. How we are able to get that ram to consume that extra energy during the breeding season when he's managed with a bunch of ewes may not necessarily be practical. But what's most important is that we understand that as that ram breeds, he's traveling 2 to 5 times more. He's expending much more calories. When we start to see dramatic weight losses in those rams of greater than 15%, we see a reduction in their drive to breed ewes. This winter, it was interesting. I got to spend some time on some large winter range country in the Red Desert area on the southern corridor of our state, an excellent resource for our state sheep industry and neighboring state sheep industries. And as I talked with certain growers, they talked about how when the rams start wandering off of the bands, that's when they know it's time to pull the rams. And I thought that was fascinating to me to some extent, but I think a lot of that probably goes back to the weight loss experienced of those lambs or those rams as they breed those ewes on those winter range conditions. They begin to lose sex drive after 15% reduction in their live body weight. So one challenge we have here in the Intermountain West is the longevity of our terminal sires, okay? And this has been an interesting source of debate as I've talked with certain producers. I alluded to the fact earlier that there is dramatic breed differences across how sheep metabolism works, their ability to keep warm and thermoregulate, okay? And treating all sheep the same isn't always going to result in the best results for us. One example of that is we conducted a survey just recently, and we're still summarizing it, but kind of getting an assessment of how many breeding seasons do producers in our region get from their terminal sires. And again, we primarily focused on larger operations, grazing range. And what we found is longevity was about 1.5 breeding seasons. Okay, as we sampled 30 producers, that's the mean that we saw. And, you know, as you look at the differences between a terminal sire and the muscle that they carry and the lack of wool cover that some of them have, especially over their visceral organs compared to a white-faced breed that's pretty well adapted to our region, feeding those the same, it is not going to result in the same outcome. And so oftentimes we see a scenario of rams coming off of their breeding season in pretty poor body condition. On a scale of 1 to 5, they're probably sitting at a 2 or a 1.5. Oftentimes those rams are gathered and they're put in the dry lot, and I won't say ignored until next breeding season, but they're sure not pampered in many instances. So a very generic scenario, and I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence, but some low quality first cutting crested wheatgrass hay. I don't know of any really good crested wheatgrass hay, but let's just take the scenario of a 6 pounds being provided to that ram of this crested wheatgrass hay, no mineral, and hoping he'll regain that condition at about 1/4 pound per day. You know, if you were to analyze that, you'd see that we vastly underfed for the protein requirements of that ram to be gaining weight, to recover from the breeding season. From a phosphorus standpoint, we're only providing about half of that, which can also affect that animal's metabolism. Take, for example, perhaps a more complex scenario. Again, in Wyoming, and we talked about this earlier with Melinda, we don't have a tremendous amount of irrigated land in Wyoming where we produce a lot of crops. So the resources that we have for feeds are alfalfa and other energy supplements, maybe corn and some barley, but for the most part, we're pretty limited in what we have available to us in the Intermountain West region. And so these scenarios represent very simplistic examples, but I'm just trying to show a little bit the inadequacy in terms of protein that we provide these rams. So take, for example, this 220-pound ram, below body condition, at a 2, we're offering him 6 pounds of feed per day, assuming that maybe he's going to eat about 5.35 pounds on a dry matter basis. And you can see the blue bar is crested wheatgrass, our lowest quality feed. The meadow hay at about 11.2% crude protein, and then 18.2% alfalfa. You can see what the requirement is, that the crested wheatgrass falls far short. The higher quality meadow hay with better digestible fiber in it does a little bit better job, and then alfalfa exceeds protein requirements, probably to the extent that a lot of that's going to be excreted. But on the column on the right, you can see that there's various outcomes and how quickly we're going to regain that body condition. Days to increase half a body condition score, or 50 to 40, up to 60. The point is that if we're feeding a low quality roughage source, hoping that those animals are going to regain their body condition, it's just not physiologically possible. And so we need to take that into account as we manage these rams. Similar story with energy. I understand that as we get a feed analysis, total digestible nutrients, or TDN, isn't the best measurement of energy, but for simplicity's sake in describing some of this, it shows that we're also going to fall short in terms of digestible energy for that ram, as TDN oftentimes overestimates how much energy is actually available. Temperature is another aspect that I think is really unique here in the Intermountain West. I was raised in the Northeast, came west after high school, but what I've observed here in the West is that the wind speed that is experienced on a relatively daily basis here, combined with ambient temperatures, really put a lot of thermoregulation demands on that animal. And this table here just shows some various temperature regions, or temperatures with fleece being wet or dry, shorn versus unshorn. And the general trend is this, is that when we have rams operating in some of the coldest temperatures of the year, and we expect those rams to breed those ewes in a timely manner and find all of them, making sure that we provide adequate energy as temperatures plummet is really, really important. It's not something that, as we have sheep that are managed many miles from where our home base is always feasible. But there's been some good work conducted over the years, especially out of North Dakota State University, looking at frequency of protein supplementation and providing, if you're going to be back every 3 days, providing 3 days worth of crude protein to help those animals maintain their nitrogen or protein status and to function the way they should. But the point is that we really dramatically see the limitations of when we pull that fleece off, the increase in energy requirements of those ewes. Something that I've thought about quite a bit is looking at just fleece cover and density of fleeces across different breeds. Many of us are familiar with the fact that our blackface or our terminal sire breeds aren't necessarily the most densely follicled animals out there, and as such have a slightly harder time thermoregulating than a dense, long stapled wool breed out on winter range. Does that mean we should not use those breeds? Absolutely not. It just means that maybe we should reevaluate the energy that we're going to provide to those terminal sires, those blackface rams, so that they can actually thrive in this new environment that they've been subject to. We oftentimes don't think about the caloric expenditure on an activity basis, but this table at the bottom right-hand corner shows us from an average standpoint what you would expect energy expenditure-wise in a housed versus a grazed sheep. Again, keep in mind what we talked about earlier is that the actual sheer amount of distance traveled is about 2 to 5 times greater for rams during the breeding season. And as a result, you would expect that their daily expenditure to be much greater in a ram breeding ewes out on pasture versus a housed pen breeding scenario. We don't have the luxury of putting our animals in a pen and breeding them in our region on a large scale. And so as a result, we probably need to evaluate how we're going to supplement while that ram is out there and account for quality of winter range as well. Some work we've been doing recently, the past 2 winters, my graduate student Alexis Julian, she's working on her master's degree, has been quantifying different trace mineral concentrations in these basal diets, like you see in this picture here, across various winter ranges in Wyoming. And what we're finding is that, and we knew this to begin with, but it's been highlighted, is that not all winter range is created equal. And what I mean by that is, generally speaking, a higher diversity of plant composition on a winter range provides a lot more flexibility and overall a higher quality diet for those ewes versus a dormant grass only winter range. You'd expect a significant difference in those nutrients. And some of those differences that we've seen so far are displayed here in this graph. You can see 2 common grass species that we've seen across these winter ranges where sheep are being bred. This is crude protein concentrations. And then the comparative increase that you see in some of those browse species available to sheep out in winter range. I think it's a great story for us to tell in the Western sheep industry that we can utilize these plant species that cattle cannot. But more importantly, the sheep can complement their diet pretty easily in a pretty diverse winter range situation in terms of crude protein. Almost 12% with salt sage, upwards of 10% with sagebrush. Now they're not going to eat 100% of their diet in those plant species, but they're going to augment their protein by consuming those browse species out on winter range. And again, just to highlight those differences, phosphorus concentrations, we are grazing sheep in the West have a greater propensity for phosphorus deficiency because we're not feeding a ton of byproducts. And again, you can see those differences with the browse or shrub species having significantly more phosphorus concentrations than the dormant grass species. And we do a lot of work with zinc, similar story. Again, it's a trace element required in different quantities than those other macronutrients, but still the importance of browse is pretty clear. Now, what about animal health? What kind of vaccination programs should our rams be under, especially our mature rams? You know, something to think about that I can't stress enough is the importance of our clostridial spectrum of diseases that are covered. On this table here, I just kind of show some of those options that we have in purchasing that vaccine. Obviously, the number in front of, the larger the number, the greater spectrum of clostridial diseases that we have coverage for. There is a greater degree of irritation with some of these in terms of immune response. You may see some inflammation, but the point is doing these 45 days prior to turnout, just getting your annual clostridial coverage is a good strategy to consider. And also to remember some of these best management practices when it comes to vaccinating our rams. We would hate for us to have that ram have an abscess on its shoulder that will limit its ability to breed. Again, orientation of that needle so that it is not causing infection in the subcutaneous space or at the muscle level. Also using the right gauge, 18 gauge needles, and then making sure the angle at which we administer that vaccine is being accounted for as well. The other thing that we found, especially when I was at Montana State and here to some degree, you know, at the university, we keep rams a long time. We evaluate their progeny. And whenever we have lost rams in the past, the necropsy would come back, wow, this ram had a lot of worms. And yet many times There was no anemia associated with that. You didn't see it in the fecal egg counts because, again, rams aren't always paid attention to the way they should be. And what I recommend, especially considering that a large proportion of our rams in the Intermountain West are maintained on sub-irrigated meadows during the summertime, close to home, okay? Higher propensity of having a parasite issue on those wetter environments will require that we provide that ram with a deworming protocol, but it has to be a dewormer that works. And that's what some of these preliminary results show you from some survey work we've been doing here in our region. We are, especially on ewes on irrigated pastures, we're seeing a large degree of resistance to the benzimidazoles, okay, your Panacur, your Safeguard, your Balbazin. We're summarizing that right now for publication, but that has been a pretty consistent finding regardless of the operation. But resistance to these drugs would mean that we would want to use something that we have more hope that is effective. Levamisole is another opportunity for us, not as widely used in the Western US as other parts of the country. We've seen greater success with the larval development assays we've used to quantify resistance, working with the University of Georgia. We found that the ivermectin and the moxidectins have been much more effective in combating the barber pole worm and other gastrointestinal nematode species. So using a product that works and making sure that we deworm that ram and vaccinate that ram in advance of breeding season is a best management practice that can help ensure success for the ram. Obviously, finding a dewormer that works is the highest priority, but also keeping track of the cost per dose based off of what we've seen in our region. And again, it's very preliminary, but it gives us a snapshot of how resistant some of the worms in our region are to the dewormers. Moxidectin is the most expensive, and that's just a reality of efficacy, right? That product, fortunately, is still working for us, but it has the highest price point. Now let's do a hard left to phenotypic scoring. I know I've seemed like I've been all over the place, but hopefully we've been able to learn something today. But the importance of being able to evaluate what kind of criteria is important to us from an economic perspective can't be overlooked on our operations. Dr. Murphy talked a lot last week of some of the most accurate forms of genetic selection that we have is through the use of breeding values. There's a wide range of breeding values that may be of interest to us that have economic relevance. Number of lambs born, post-weaning growth, carcass composition, wool traits. Well, what about those other phenotypic scoring methods that we don't have EBVs for? And you know, I list some of those here, but as I've worked with producers that have very different selection paradigms and have very different markets for those rams or replacement ewes that they raise, the commonality that I think is good for everyone is that the criteria is based off of some hard distinguishable scoring systems, but also that criteria is relevant to that specific operation. We can't be chasing traits that don't have economic relevance on our operations. And as such, some of these may not apply to everyone, but let's talk a little bit about some of these scoring systems. One of those that I think is timeless is face wool cover in our region. Some early work done in the 1940s at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station found that those ewes with heavy blind cover or cover over the muzzle at the top of the nose had the chance to reduce the vision of that ewe, and as a result, less lambs were raised in a production system. Now, this is a heritable trait. Do we have a breeding value for it? No. But if we have a wool blind ram, such as what we see in score 4 or 3, its progeny have a greater chance of being wool blind as well. And so that's a phenotypic score that is pretty easily to screen against, but it's given less emphasis perhaps recently than I've seen over the past. Belly wool is another one of those. Again, you can see the image on the left, that short, compressed, yolky and greasy fiber is very different from the staple at the top of the image there on the back line of that animal. Belly wool, as the name implies, should be restricted to the belly region. and it's another highly heritable trait, but it results in a more variable fleece that generates more wastage at first stage processing. It's something that we can put selection pressure against on our operation using a system to the right there with some consistent images that allow us to be consistent and not be persuaded by other redeeming parts of that animal. Interestingly, this ram here to the left was an 18 micron yearling ram, okay? But if you look at the variation from the staple, from the top line down to the belly, you can see that if we just looked at micron, we probably would have overlooked some of those other undesirable aspects. Fiber pigmentation, okay, that is a major detriment to the fine wool industry, okay, especially at first stage processing levels. Having a good eye for those parts of the animal that may have fiber pigmentation is a good strategy to keep from too much of that occurring in our flock. You can see here, this comes from Meat and Livestock Australia, but again, it delineates and helps us see that there's a quantifiable difference between a score 1 and a score 2 from a score 5. And identifying where your flock or those replacement ewes or those replacement rams that you're wanting to sell, putting an initial screen on those based off of some of this criteria can really increase the overall quality, whether you're raising range rams or stud rams. Again, not to beat a dead horse, but fiber pigmentation, another metric that can be used is pigmentation in the hoof and around the nose and the eye as a way of avoiding those colored fibers. We don't analyze a whole lot of color characteristics in the wool we produce here. In the US, I think that's an opportunity for us, especially in our fine wool producing regions. Those leading fine wool producing countries, this is an important part of their selection. And in really discriminating against those yellow and yolky colored stud rams or replacement ewe lambs, also paying attention to the character, right? Character from a wool judging perspective, we often talk about the crimp, color, and then the condition. And you can see score 1 and 2 and 3 have what we would consider more crimp design. 4 and 5 have less so. And as a result, again, since wool in the suite of wool traits are highly heritable, this might be another tool that we have to kind of delineate some of those qualities in the absence of more accurate breeding values. I spent some time in Uruguay and Argentina this year visiting some of their wool labs down there. This is an old color scale, a scala de color, but they have more automated methods now that make it even more accurate. But I think color is something, especially in our fine wool producing flocks, that can be paid more attention to. Jaw alignment and incisor alignment. This is one that I've seen more prominent than I'd like to see, and that's why I'm mentioning it today. It's really important that the dental pad and the incisor teeth line up, and that there's very little gap, either undershot or overshot, in those animals that we're selecting. I could tell you horror stories, even here at the university, that oftentimes we may have overlooked this, but it's really important, especially of those of us working in forage-based operations. If we have an undershot jaw or an overshot jaw, the ability to clip that grass is diminished. It has to meet the dental pad so that plant material can be broken and consumed. And as a result, if we're not paying attention to that, we can see differential wear in the teeth, but more so, we start to see those animals lose body condition in more challenging grazing environments, right? We expect those animals, especially in the Intermountain West, to be able to browse certain shrubs, and without that alignment of the dental pad and the incisor teeth, that is really difficult. So that's one that I think if I had to rank any of these phenotypic scores, I'd place way at the top because I'm seeing more of it, and it's unfortunate. What about premolar and molar wear? That's not as easy for us to evaluate, but there's some visual cues that maybe we can pay attention to. Generally speaking, when we see uneven wear of the premolars and molar teeth, we start to see sharp ridges on the outer edge of the upper and lower molars, okay? Now, I've stuck my hand in a sheep's mouth enough to know that I'm not about 50% about getting my fingers pinched. But a good visual cue without having to do that is just to see how those animals consume roughage You know, you got them in a ram pen consuming out of a bale feeder. That telltale sign of that uneven wear is full cheeks. The mouth is held slightly open, and you'll see fibrous feed sticking out of the sides of the mouth, okay? And I think most simplistic, but also a really good indicator, is those rams in poor condition are in poor condition for a reason. It could be internal parasites from carryover from previous seasons. It could be that molar wear. It could be a number of things. But then what's important is we use all of those in tandem to identify those issues. You know, this is something that we've used in our sheep production class. We conduct 2 ram tests here at the University of Wyoming. Our white-faced ram test coincides with our sheep production class. So one of our labs is to actually get some of our students out there applying some of these scores to the rams on test. It's a good exercise because, again, this is something that I think perhaps if we focus entirely on quantitative selection, we don't have EBVs to tell us how sound legs and feet are. And so that's a really important consideration that we incorporate these phenotypic measures, again, using a specific scoring criteria so that we make sure that not only are those rams genetically the best, but phenotypically the best to excel in their breeding environment. Again, pasterns, score of 1 is one extreme, score of 5, really soft on the pasterns. Looking at a score of 3 as being ideal. That's something to keep an eye on. Something that I've seen quite a bit in certain populations of our fine wool sheep is not so much the score 5 or that sickle-hawked type of conformation, but I've seen a lot more post-legged rams. And as a result, that puts a lot of pressure on the hips and, again, impedes travel and ability to seek out those ewes and be comfortable. So a score of 2 and 3 are more desirable to me than obviously the 1 and the 5. Shoulder and back, I think we get the picture. What's important is that we take home the phenotypic criteria that makes a difference on our operation. I want to be clear because this seems to be a point of contention. It doesn't need to be, but you know, it's not an either or type of a scenario. We can still put some visual pressure on the sheep that we select without throwing out the proven and most advanced selection technologies that we have, which are estimated breeding values. Quantitative selection or breeding values can't ignore phenotypic evaluation. We've got to have our eyes on both of those, and we have to have a system that's repeatable, that we can share with our buyers, that ensure that our rams are going to last longer and breed more ewes. And you know, based off of the conversation from the previous week's webinar, I think it stimulated some really good conversation. I've had a couple of correspondences with producers that, you know, this idea of, well, those sheep aren't as good as mine. Those NSIP sheep just aren't as good as mine, or vice versa, right? I think that is a moot point to some extent because it all goes back to what we're measuring. If we're only measuring how eye-appealing something is on our operation, chances are we're probably not getting at the most economic traits. Similarly, if we're only looking at a breeding value or a percentile, we may be missing those phenotypic traits that we've worked hard to improve in our flock. And so it's really not an either or. I think there's various ways to improve how we raise our sheep and produce more productive sheep, but ultimately we can never manage what we don't measure. And with that, I've been all over the place, but I'll take some questions.
So thank you very much, Whit. I love when you get on and share all of that valuable information with everybody. Obviously, now that you're our collaborator, we'll have you back a bunch of times. So everybody tune in for more information from Whit. Next week, we're going to talk about some of the management considerations that you can make with your ewes and does to make genetic improvements. And I'll be your speaker next week. So tune into that. Again, any information or events that we have coming up are going to be on our Facebook pages, and all the webinars will be posted to the YouTube channel after they are done live. And if you guys please fill out the survey as you jump off, that would be great. And moving into next week, we look forward to having you back. Thank you, guys.